Welcome to the next installment in my lecture series for the Principles of Microeconomics course. This one deals with changes in equilibrium price and quantity. So the objectives here are to understand, number one, how changes in demand will impact equilibrium price and quantity in the marketplace. So in order to do that, you need to remember what the determinants of demand are. Again, the determinants of demand are income, the price of related goods, people's expectations about what happens in the future, and people's tastes and preferences. In a previous video lecture, I went over those in detail. Make sure you remember all the determinants of demand, and in particular, how those changes in the determinants of demand impact the demand curve, whether it shifts the demand curve to the right or to the left. After we do and go through a few examples of how the equilibrium changes for demand, we're then going to take a look at the supply side. So we're going to do exactly the same thing with supply. And again, you're going to need to know what the determinants of supply are. And for the purposes of this course, think of this as the cost of doing business. Wages, the cost of capital, i.e. the cost of machinery for the business, taxes on the business, regulation of the business, etc. So make sure you remember those determinants and particularly how they cause the supply curve to shift when those determinants change. Also remember that we are operating under this assumption of ceteris paribus, that all other things are equal. That means that the only thing we're changing in this marketplace is the item that I talk about changing. For example, if I say there's an increase in income for a normal good, the assumption that we are operating under is this is the only thing that is changing in the marketplace. We're holding every other thing constant. So the only thing we're concerned with is the impact of the change, whether it's demand or supply. What is the impact of that change on equilibrium price and quantity? We don't have to concern ourselves with any other changes. So let me bring up what your starting point for this is. Anytime I ask a question or ask for an analysis of a change in equilibrium price and quantity, this graph right here should be your starting point, because this illustrates the equilibrium in a marketplace where supply and demand intersect one another. That gives us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And let me actually group those together so it'll be a little bit easier to see. So when I highlight it, so here we are. There is our equilibrium price and quantity, where supply and demand intersect one another. And let me do that for supply and then do it for demand. So here's our supply curve. Always remember that your supply curve is upward sloping. All right, the law of supply states that there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. And here's our demand curve. It's downward sloping. The law of demand states that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Where demand and supply intersect, that gives us our equilibrium price and quantity. Make sure, I would advise people that they practice this. To practice, for example, make sure you label price and quantity correctly, that you draw the supply and demand curves correctly, and that you show that the intersection between supply and demand is our equilibrium price and quantity. All right, so this one is very important, this graph right here, because this is a starting point, and I recommend that you practice writing this out yourself, graphing this yourself, because there is a probability the question like this will be on the first exam and on the final exam. So this is our starting point. Let's actually go into looking at if there is a change in one of the determinants of demand. Let's assume that this change in the determinant of demand is an increase in income for normal good. So make sure you remember that income is a determinant of demand. So as soon as you see in a problem that I'm changing income or there's a change in income, you know that the demand curve is what is going to shift. So as soon as you see that there's an increase in income, the first thing that should pop off in your head is the demand curve is going to physically change its location. The second part of this is which way does it shift? Okay? That is something that you have to know. Remember what I told you previously, that income, a change in income for a normal good, there's a positive relationship between this change and the demand curve. That means if there's an increase in income and it's a normal good, the demand curve will also increase. So we will see an increase in demand. So let me label this D0 to just denote that this is our original demand curve. So when you do a question like this, make sure that if your demand or supply curve is changing, make sure you label it so I can tell which one's the original demand curve and which one's the new demand curve. Or if you're shifting supply, make sure you label the supply curve as the original versus the new supply curve so I know which is the original and which is the new supply curve. So because there's a positive relationship between an increase in income for a normal good and the demand curve will shift to the right. So when you answer a question like this, just draw in a new demand curve that is shifted to the right. So here's a new demand curve, and let me make that a solid line. So there is our new demand curve. So when you label that D1 to denote that it is a new demand curve. So where is the new equilibrium? The new equilibrium occurs where the new demand curve, D1, and let me group those two together, where D1 intersects the original supply curve. So this point right here gives me the new equilibrium. So let me draw in some dotted lines here to indicate that. So here is the new price, and here is the new quantity. All right, and if I label this, and let me change this to P0, there's the original equilibrium quantity, and this is, price, and this is the new equilibrium quantity. Here is P1, make it subscript, and here is Q1. So if we have an increase in income for a normal good, what will happen to the equilibrium price? The equilibrium price will increase. The new price is higher than the original price, and what happens to the quantity? The equilibrium quantity will also increase. So if we see an increase in income for a normal good, our prediction is, and these look a little bit larger, make them a little bit smaller. You see what their size are. Apologies for that, it's a size 28. Don't know how that got changed on me. Don't know how I didn't notice that they had changed on me. This is 28. Again, apologies for this. I'm not quite as technologically savvy as I used to be. So we can see that if there's an increase in income for a normal good, the demand curve shifts out from D0 to D1. The equilibrium point moves from the original equilibrium to the new equilibrium, and that gives us a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. Let me group those together so when I highlight them you can see them both. So if I were to ask a question like this on an exam, make sure that you can go through the mechanics of doing this. So let me give you another example. Let me bring up a different example for you. Let's say there's an increase in income for an inferior good. And I see that I did not group these together. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping here. So we have our downward sloping demand curve, our upward sloping supply curve, and where they intersect we have our equilibrium price and quantity. Again, as soon as we see that there's an increase in income, we know that the demand curve is going to be impacted. So I can put the D0 in here to show that this is my original demand curve. And here's our equilibrium price and quantity, and let me change this to D0, I'm sorry, P0 and Q0 to show us that these are our original equilibrium prices and quantities. As soon as I see income, I know the demand curve is going to shift. If I see increase in income and inferior good, I know that the demand curve is going to shift to the left. It's going to shift inward. So the new demand curve is going to be inside of our original demand curve. So if we go from here to here, here is our new demand curve. And let me call that D1 to signify that this is the new demand curve. So the demand curve has shifted inward. This is our original demand curve and this is our new demand curve. D1 represents demand after there's been an increase in income for this inferior good. Where is the new equilibrium? The new equilibrium is where our new demand curve intersects the original supply curve. So let me draw in this. Here's where this demand and supply curves intersect one another. Make sure I got that on all of them. It doesn't look like it, does it? There we go. That's a little bit. Hey, you son of a gun. Can't believe that did that to me. This thing's a little quirky. Sometimes you put dots in and it doesn't get the dot exactly right. So here is where my equilibrium price is going to be, and here is going to be where my new equilibrium quantity is going to be. So let me label this P1, and let me label this Q1. And let me group those together so it's a little bit easier to see. That is our new equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. So, when an increase in income occurs for an inferior good, our prediction being with no other things changing in this marketplace, we should expect the price of this product to fall and the quantity also to fall. So here was our original equilibrium with our original demand. With an increase in income, and this being an inferior good, the demand curve shifts to the left, and we have a new equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. So both the new equilibrium price and quantity are less than the original price and quantity. Let me give you an example when we talk about related goods. In particular, let's talk about complementary goods. And I can see, once again, I've got to do a bit of housekeeping to group these together. Again, apologies for the delay here. So here's our equilibrium price and quantity. Again, we have an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. Let me change this to P0 and Q0. So this is our starting point. Here's the original equilibrium prices and quantities. For a complementary good, and this is something that oftentimes confuses people, we are talking about the change in one good and how the change in that one good impacts the demand for another. So basically, if you want to think about it, I'm changing the price of good A and taking a look at how that impacts the demand for good B. For example, an example of complementary goods are cars and gasoline, as long as it's not an electric car. All right? So, for example, if the price of gasoline were to go up dramatically, let's say $10 a gallon, that would impact the demand for cars. So that's what I mean by related goods. I'm changing the price of one good and seeing how it impacts the demand for another good. So let's do that. What I've told you is that since these goods are complementary, that the increase in the price of a complementary good, there's an inverse relationship between the change in the price of a good, of a complementary good, and the demand for the other good. So, for example, an increase in the price of gasoline would cause the demand for cars that use gas to go down. People would shift away to other items. They would probably use public transportation more frequently. They might switch to hybrid vehicles or completely electric vehicles. So realize that. So we have our original demand, and since it is a change in the price of a complementary good, that is a determinant of demand. I know that the demand curve is going to change. So when there's an increase, a change in the price of a complementary good, all right, uh, they have a tendency to move together. So if I increase, if they move in opposite directions, so this increase in the price of the complementary good will cause demand to decrease. So here's our original demand curve. If I draw in a new demand curve, the demand curve will shift inward. And this is our new demand. So that is D1. So this shift from D0 to D1 is caused by the fact that we have an increase in the price, and the goods that the increase in the price of this particular good, they're complementary to one another. The increase in the price of good A has caused demand for good B to decrease. All right, I'll give you another example of complementary goods. For example, a lot of gaming systems. I guess unless you can hack them, if you buy a Xbox 360, you have to buy Xbox 360 games. So if the price of the Xbox 360 or whatever the gaming system went up dramatically, the demand for the games for that system would go down because fewer people would buy that gaming system, and then by default that game. So what is going to be the new equilibrium price? It's just where our new demand curve intersects the original supply curve. So if I go from the intersection point of supply and demand and straight across, and the intersection point of supply and demand straight down, that gives me the equilibrium prices and quantities. So this is P1, that's our new equilibrium price, and this is Q1, which is our new equilibrium quantity. So, because of the increase in the price of a complementary good, the demand for the good that we're analyzing this market for, the demand curve shifts inward. This causes the equilibrium price to fall, and it causes the equilibrium quantity to fall. And let me group these together so they're easier to see. So here was our original equilibrium. After the increase in price of a complementary good, the demand curve shifted inward, moved us to a new equilibrium point, and we see that the new equilibrium price is less than the original equilibrium price, and the new equilibrium quantity is less than our original equilibrium quantity. Let me give you another example for a related good. And once again, I have to do a little bit of housekeeping work. I should be a little better organized with this, but this is my initial attempts at using this software and doing the videotaping. So hopefully I can use this as a basis and improve this over time. So we have our upward sloping demand curve, our upward sloping supply curve, excuse me, and our downward sloping demand curve. And here's our equilibrium price and quantity to start out. So let me make this P0 and Q0. And what we have occurring in this market is that we have an increase in the price, but of a substitute good. All right? So a substitute good is something that can be used in place of another product. Some examples that I gave you previously. For example, some people consider coffee and tea to be substitutes. When the price of coffee goes up dramatically, People substitute away from coffee and they start drinking tea or drinking other types of beverages because it's too expensive for them to drink coffee. So think of that as substitute goods that can be used in place of one another. All right, for example, one example I gave was Coca-Cola and Pepsi. I consider them to be substitute goods for one another. I can taste the difference between the two. I know there's a difference between the two, but to me they're both cola products. So if I go into a place and a can of Coca-Cola is $3 a can and a can of Pepsi is $1, I'm going to buy the Pepsi. I'll substitute away because Coca-Cola is more expensive. So let's do that as an example. The example I will use here, I will tell you that assuming that coffee and tea are substitute goods. If we see a dramatic increase in the price of coffee, how does that impact the demand for tea? All right, the demand for tea in all likelihood will go up. People will substitute away from coffee as it goes up in price. For example, I know there's every once in a while, every 10 or 15 years, something happens to the coffee crop, and 20% of the coffee crop gets destroyed by frost. And this causes the price of coffee to go up dramatically. Generally, during that time, when the price of coffee goes up, you will see people substitute away and buy more tea. So if there's an increase in the price of a substitute good, we will see the demand for the alternative good go up. So if we see an increase in the price of coffee, we will see the demand for tea go up. So let's draw in our new demand curve. And let me make that a solid line. And this is D1. And again, it changed to a larger font. Or did it? I guess it didn't. All right, let me draw this up here. So this is our new demand curve. This is the demand after the price of coffee went up dramatically, causing the demand for tea to increase. People are substituting away from coffee and over to tea. Let us draw in where the new equilibrium is. The new equilibrium occurs where the new demand curve intersects our original supply curve. So if we go to the point where they intersect one another and straight across, and if we go from the point that the supply and demand intersect one another and go straight down, that gives us our equilibrium quantity. So this is P1. That's our new price, and this is our new quantity. So what do we end up seeing? That when the price of coffee goes up, the demand for tea increases, and this causes the price of tea to go up, and the quantity of the equilibrium quantity of tea in the marketplace to also increase. So we see that this increase in the price of a substitute good causes the price to go up and the equilibrium quantity to go up. So I just gave you 4 examples. Make sure you're comfortable with all the examples. Also realize that for the different slides that I did, that if I make the opposite occur, like if I gave you the example there was an increase in income for a normal good, the demand curve shifted to the right. If there's a decrease in income for a normal good, the demand curve shifts to the left. So the examples I gave you, there's also a counter to that. If the price or income moves in opposite directions, that just means the demand curve also moves in the opposite direction as what I have on those slides originally. So make sure, this is important because in general I do ask a question about a change in equilibrium in the market, and particularly from the demand side. Make sure you're comfortable with this. It's very important that you are able to do this. Like I said, I generally do ask one question on the first test and one question on the final. That relates to changes in equilibrium with the changes is not a word. Changes in demand and changes in supply. So make sure you're comfortable with the determinants of demand and the determinants of supply. And make sure you're also comfortable with, if they change, how does the equilibrium price and quantity change in the marketplace.